here of Lister Model Works, and welcome to Volume 4 in our Model Crafter series. Yes, Model Crafter, the video series that feeds your addiction on modeling and leaves your wives and girlfriends shaking their head in wonderment. Anyway, in this volume, we've got a brand new kit for you produced by Resin Realities. It's called Sasquatch. It was sculpted by Joe Ludati, and it's based on a fantasy painting by artist Ken Kelley. I'd like to throw a special thank you out to John Diaz of Resin Realities for supplying this great kit. If you want to order this kit or any of the other kits produced by Resin Realities, here's the website. See, right down here. Here it is, right here. And all the other websites will be at the end of the video on the end credits. So you can contact Joe or you can contact Ken. He's got some fantastic artwork. And Joe, he's a legend in the garage kit industry. Anyway, let's get started on Sasquatch. I think maybe I'd better go check and make sure that the castle door is locked.
Okay, here's the Resin Realities Sasquatch. Nice artwork there done by Joe Ludati. This kit was a joy to do. I mean, it was a joy to build and paint. All the parts came wrapped in bubble wrap, as you can see here. Very nice casting. John Diaz did a remarkable job, and all his hard work definitely shows in how this kit was cast. There's the upper body. It was a very clean casting and a very sharp casting as well. I mean, the details are just outstanding in this kit. So that's a tribute to Joe as well as John. There's the Mohawk piece. There were 11 pieces total in this kit, including the base and the 2 mouth inserts. However, for the purpose of this demonstration, John supplied 2 separate heads, and I'll talk more about that later on in the video. There's the other head. And here's the lower body and the one leg as one piece. So this gives you a rough idea of how this kit was actually broken down. And again, the castings were very clean for all these parts, and the fit was also quite exceptional. I had to do very little cleanup on this kit. There was a little bit of flashing here and there, a couple of little, minor seam lines, but I didn't have to do anything major to this kit whatsoever. Here's all the parts laid out. Of course, what I like to do is I like to test fit all the parts at first, the same as with any other model kit. You want to look the parts over, familiarize yourself with the kit. There's a little bit of a seam line there on the inside of the leg. That was about the extent of what was on this kit. These castings, like I said, they were extremely clean, very well done. Now, for when you're working with resin, it's a good idea to use a Dremel tool. You can fit it with little grinding bits or sanding drums, sanding pads, cutting wheels. For when you're working with resin, that's really quite an indispensable tool to have. And this particular one I have is a multi-speed. So there's a speed selector here that allows you to control the speed of the tool. You can also get the optional flexi shaft, which you connect to the end of the tool, and this allows you to use your Dremel like you would either an airbrush or a pen or a pencil. You simply hold the flexi shaft, and that way you have much finer control over what you're doing. And if your eyesight isn't all that great, you're going to need an optivisor. This is another indispensable tool for working with small details, such as faces, eyes, mouths. Now what I did was I started with the lower body and leg piece, and I wanted to try to clean away any of the excess resin that may have been in there. This is just a standard technique. You want to try and smooth out the areas as much as possible because you want a tight fit of all those parts. You want to try to keep the putty work down to a minimum. And what actually helps is by cleaning up the parts, you get a much tighter fit against each other so that there's not much of a seam, and that way you don't have to do as much putty work. So I'm just cleaning up the edges best I can. I'm not doing anything major because, again, the fit was actually quite good. The seams were really rather tight. But I'm just trying to get those areas smoothed out as much as possible because, it helps with the fit. And here I'm actually test fitting both the lower body part and the leg. And as you can see, even with just a test fit, there's very little of a seam there. It's a little bit of a gap, but that's not bad at all. So very little putty work will have to be done here. Now it's time to apply the glue. And I'm using super glue. And as a matter of fact, this particular glue, this is the Bob Smith Industries super glue. Along with, you can see a bottle of Accelerator sitting there. And many hobby shops, including Hobbytown USA, put their own labels on this glue when they sell it. I find it's a very good glue to use. I've tried some of the other brands. What I like about Bob Smith Industries glue is that the Accelerator will not affect any paint. Sometimes I used to have a problem using some of the other accelerators, and it would actually affect the paint. But for some reason, the Bob Smith Industries stuff doesn't affect the paint. And the glue is a very good quality glue. So I apply the glue to both halves, and then I'm carefully fitting the leg into the socket. And then, of course, you come back with some Accelerator, and you just want to spritz that over the seam, around the side, the front. And that instantly sets the bond, by the way. If you're not too familiar with Accelerator, that's what it's for. It instantly sets the bond. Makes waiting very easy. Now here I'm test fitting the arm to the shoulder. And again, there's very little gap there, so it won't require very much in the way of putty work. I did have to clean up the edge there on the arm a little bit, not much. It's sort of flanged out a little bit, so I took my Dremel and the little grinding bit, and I softened that edge a little bit. The right arm fit just as well. There was very little putty work that had to be done to where the arms even joined. You always want to test fit the parts first. Don't ever just pick up the parts and start gluing. Now here, in order to make sure that the head fit better into the shoulder socket, I used the Dremel and a sanding drum, and I just sort of cleaned out the socket a little bit, tried to smooth it out a little bit more, because there again, the goal is to try and get those parts to fit as tightly together as possible to minimize the amount of putty work. And again, I'm taking the base of the head, and I'm just sort of trying to flatten it out a little bit. Just want to make sure that it fits into that socket a little bit better. So you just want to try to minimize any sort of lumps or bumps that may be there. Because again, the goal is to try and minimize the putty work. I know that sounds like a broken record, but that's the ultimate goal. You want to keep that putty work down to a minimum. And that's true with any model kit, no matter what you're building. Okay, now at this point, before gluing the head on, you're going to have to make a decision whether or not you want to use the supplied Mohawk, or if you want to model your Sasquatch without the Mohawk. So you're going to have to decide, do I want to do this putty work or use the Mohawk? Now here's a side-by-side comparison showing the differences. The one on the left obviously is with the Mohawk. The one on the right is sans Mohawk. So if you're not going to use the Mohawk, you're going to have to do some putty work, and a little bit more than just filling a seam. You're literally going to have to sculpt some hair. So using some Magic Sculpt, the 2-part epoxy putty, I'm kneading the part A and part B together here, and once I have this kneaded completely so that both parts are mixed thoroughly, I take some of the Magic Sculpt and I put it, and again here I'm using the optional head, which I got as part of this demonstration, and I'm simply pressing the putty into the trough on the top of the head, and once I have it in there, I come back and I simply smooth it or flange it out to the edges of the head of the, or rather the edges of the trough, to try to blend it into the head. And you know, once you have the putty firmly in there and you've got it to a fairly decent shape, you simply come back with a sculpting tool of choice. I'm using a toothpick here, and I simply took the toothpick and I scribed lines through the soft putty, and all I simply tried to do here was to recreate the hair texture, or some hair texture, and tried to replicate what was already sculpted onto the head. And then I simply made sure that it was all you know, sculpted back so that the hair flowed to the back of the head. And here's 4 photographs showing various angles of how it looked once I had the hairpiece, if you will, hairpiece sculpted onto the optional head. It really didn't require a great deal of work, and I'm certainly no sculptor. All I simply did was applied some putty to the area, and then again, like I said, I came back with a toothpick, and I simply scribed some lines, some crisscross lines, some wavy lines, and I tried to blend the putty so that it sort of looked like the hair that was already there. Okay, well here I'm actually test fitting the head to make sure that I've sanded away enough area where I can get a snug fit. And you can see there's still a little bit of a seam there, but not too bad. There's a little bit of a seam along the back, but that's going to be puttied. And as long as we keep the seam to a minimum, we can keep the putty work down to a minimum. And just as with the leg, I'm going to go ahead here and apply some super glue to the neck area on the upper body. And again, you want to apply enough glue to make contact with as much of the surface as possible. You don't want to put too much and have it run or ooze out, but you want to make sure you've got a good healthy amount on there. And you want to do the same for the other part. And this is so that if there are any irregularities that still exist, the glue will adhere somewhere under there, especially when you spritz it with the kicker or the accelerator, so that whatever glue drips down from the upper part will still make contact, and you'll at least get a really good bond. So you just want to bring both parts together, make sure you key it together just right, and then you want to take the accelerator or the kicker. Once you get the parts together, hold them together, and then go ahead and spritz it. And there you go. Once you do that, the bond is set. And again, any seams that exist we'll take care of with some putty work. Now I'm going to test fit the arm, and looking pretty good. Looking pretty good. Cleaned it up very well, although it didn't require a great deal of cleanup. So that's gonna work very well. One thing you want to do is you want to make sure you clean out any of the areas between any of the fingers or toes. Sometimes you'll have a little bit of flashing in there. Sometimes there'll be some seams. So you just want to take a little bit of sandpaper or a file or even the edge of the hobby knife, and you just want to get in there and try to clean out the seams as much as possible. Again, this was a very cleanly cast kit, and there was very little cleanup. There were just a few little sections of flashing in there, but nothing major at all. And I just came back with a hobby knife and I scraped the seams a little bit. And again, it was very, very clean, and it cleaned up very nicely. Now here is the finished piece, fully assembled. It's just been assembled here. There's no putty work applied yet, no primer. Here's some close-up shots of the seams, the areas that will require putty. And as you can see, that it went together very cleanly. Now I'm going to pull out the old Magic Sculpt, which is a 2-part epoxy putty. Comes with a resin and a hardener, and you knead them together just like plumber's putty. And this stuff is water soluble, and so that means you can use water to smooth it. And so I mix up a good amount. Sometimes I end up mixing up more than I actually use, but at least that way I've always got extra just in case I do need it. And you just want to knead it till you have a nice uniform color. And I'm going to start with the neck, and I'm going to fill in the gap along the whole perimeter of the neck. And I take some of the Magic Sculpt and tear some off, and I roll it into a nice thinned out sort of like a string, and that way I can lay it all along the perimeter of the neck and just sort of fill in the crevice that surrounds the entire neck area there. So you just want to have enough to really get into that crevice, and you also want to make sure you have enough so that you can blend it to the outer edges. So I just take some of the putty here and I just push it into the crevice, and as I'm pushing it in, I'm also sort of spreading it out, and that way I can feather it toward the toward the head and toward the neck area. And then I come back using a toothpick and I just simply follow the lines or the texture of the hair, leading from the chin area down to the shoulder. And of course, now using any sort of sculpting tool, you're going to end up with very hard-edged lines. So you want to come back with a brush, and again, you can use water with Magic Sculpt, and you just simply paint the water over it, and that smooths out all of the lines. Takes away those really sharp edges. That way it blends better, and sometimes you end up having to work back and forth. You may have to come back with your sculpting tool and even rescribe some of the lines. But again, it's just a matter of getting the texture right and just trying to match it as best you can. And so once the neck area was done, then I went ahead and I did the arm, well, both arms, and you can use various sculpting tools. You don't have to use a toothpick. You just simply find a tool that works best for you. I just find that a toothpick works the best. And of course, once the neck was done, I took some more water and a brush, and I went over it and I smoothed it out the best I could. Again, just trying to match the texture that was already there. Then I moved on to the mohawk. And then here I'm taking a Q-tip, because that way I could smooth it out by applying a little bit more pressure than with a brush. Here I'm just sort of blending, again, I'm feathering those edges into the parts to try to blend the putty more seamlessly. And as you can see here, I've got it blended fairly well. It's nice and feathered into that crevice. And then, of course, once you have the putty feathered out, you simply come back with a sculpting tool of your choosing, and you try to replicate that texture as best as possible. Depending on your sculpting skills, you should be able to do quite well. I am certainly no sculptor, as I said before. I did the same thing on the hip area here, where the leg joined to the lower body. Same thing with the inner leg area, as well as the waist. Again, it was just a matter of following the texture lines there. As you can see here, I was able to blend the texture rather well for not being a sculptor. Here are the teeth pieces that I left out until after some of the painting was done. Now here's the log that fits to the base, and as you can see, there's a slight gap here, nothing major. I was able to putty that with no problem. I simply blended it using a little bit of Magic Sculpt, and again, coming back with a toothpick or any other sculpting tool, you simply blend the lines together, and presto. That way the log looks like it continues right on down into the base. But as you can see, the log tends to pivot. That's because the fit into the trough area on the base isn't the greatest in the world. So what I decided to do was I took some Magic Sculpt and I laid it into that trough area, and that built that area up so that when I put the log in there, it added to the base so that the log wouldn't pivot. It closed the gap where the log fit into that area. And I simply put the putty in. Then using the actual log, I fit it down toward the bottom, made sure it was flush against the part on the base, and then I simply pressed the log down into that area so that when I lifted the log back out, I actually had an impression of the bottom of the log that matched the impression in the putty. That way it was as though the putty and the log were then keyed. And I simply came back and I smoothed it out a little bit, and I wanted to do another impression just to make sure that it didn't move. So I wiped it with some water, and then that way it wouldn't stick to it. And then I simply at this point I just sculpted. I feathered the edge of the putty so that it blended more to the base. So I used a sculpting tool, and then I just simply spread the putty out a little bit along the edge, just so it would blend to the base more. Whenever you do any putty work on a model, especially if it's a figure model, a base like this, anything that requires, or rather anything that has texture, you're going to want to, when you apply the putty, you're going to want to try to texture it as much as possible so that it blends. If you're doing a smooth subject that requires putty, then obviously it's a whole different story, because you're going to putty it, and then you're going to literally sand the hell out of it. Now here I just wanted to feather the back portion out a little bit, just to sort of give it a little bit of a finished look, as though the putty was a part of the base. Now this is actually optional at this point. You don't even have to do this. You could throw some 5-minute epoxy under there, and you would probably get a very good bond. I simply chose to do this as a way to keep any gaps from being under there. This way there was no gap. I knew that with putting the putty in there, that log was going to rest right into there, and that there would be no gap. And again, using a little bit of water on a brush, I wanted to smooth that area out just so that it blended a little bit more with the base. Even though a lot of these details wouldn't even be seen. Once everything was painted, you probably wouldn't even be able to tell. Now, I did the same thing with his right foot. There was a gap under the foot, especially the area under the toes. So again, I took some Magic Sculpt and I made an impression by first putting the putty to the base, and then I pressed his foot into the putty, leaving an entire footprint. That way it was keyed, just like with the log, so that when it came time to glue him to the base, his foot was going to rest totally securely into that impression. That also adds the feeling or the look of weight, that the character does have definite weight, and that all his weight is simply resting or forced into the ground, causing an impression. The other foot wasn't as bad, so I left that one alone. And here's the model with all the putty work completed, ready for priming. Okay, here I have the model on a screened-in porch because, of course, I'm using a can of an enamel, and I'm using, actually, the paint I'm using is by Walmart. It's I think it's called Color Place, and I applied some light mist coats at first, and now I'm coming back with a heavier coat, and I'm using white because the white's going to show all the color better when I start applying the colors to this. It'll definitely show up better on video that way. Here the model has been completely primed and it is now dry and ready to receive some color. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to mix up a flesh color for the fleshy areas. So I'm going to start off with some white, and then I'm also going to use a little bit of red and some yellow and some dark brown. Here I'm applying the flesh color using a Badger Anthem airbrush. For more information on airbrushing, see my other video, Figure Model Airbrushing. It covers way more dealing with airbrushing than this video does, obviously. And here you just want to get a nice even coat of paint over all the flesh areas of the model. The face, the chest area, the abdomen, the palms of the hands, on the back of the hands, around the fingers, and of course the feet. Now here I'm mixing up a dark chocolate brown color, and again this is for airbrushing, so I had to mix it to the proper viscosity. And I'm using this color to paint the fur. So again, using the Badger Anthem, the only difference is, of course, here I've got the compressor set from approximately 5 to 10 psi, because I need to get close in order to get this nice feathered edge where the fur texture meets the flesh texture. See how close I am here? I want to get nice and close because that gives me greater control. And I'm coming back through all the musculature here to just create some shadow areas. And here's the model with all the flesh areas painted and the nice feathered edges where the fur texture meets the flesh areas. And now it's time to come back and, using basically the same colors, only more white and yellow this time, I'm going to mix up a dry brushing color so that we can now dry brush the textures of the fur. And of course, as you probably either already know or perhaps you've seen my other videos already, dry brushing is a dark to light process. Over a darker base color, you're going to come back with a lighter shade, and all you're basically going to do is you're going to hit the topmost surfaces, you know, the actual texture itself, which makes all those details just pop right out. And these palette trays are great for mixing paint. If you don't use these already, I can't express enough how versatile these are, and they're great for mixing and blending colors this way. I highly recommend you lay in get a nice selection of these palette trays. They're great. And of course, for dry brushing, you don't want a lot of paint on the brush. So after you're done mixing or blending the colors, you want to wipe off most of the paint. You want very little paint on that brush for dry brushing. You see here, if I take the brush and I just scrub it against that paper towel, all you can see on the paper towel is where it hit against the texture. See that? You don't want the paint to fill in those areas. And as you can see here, I'm scrubbing the brush against the texture on the model. And you can just come back and you can just add a little bit of color. You can change the color, the tone. And again, you want very little paint on that brush. See that texture? See how it just pops right out once you apply that dry brushing? That's what you want. You want to be able to see those details. And here's a quick review on dry brushing again. Very little paint on that brush, but you see how all I'm doing is I'm just hitting the raised areas on that paper towel. See? That's what dry brushing is all about. You want to be able to bring out all that texture and detail. Sculptors spend a great deal of time sculpting these kits. And unless you dry brush, you're not going to see all those details. Very little paint on that brush. Very little indeed. But that little bit of paint can work wonders. All you do is you just scrub against the texture. Now, when it came to painting the face, I decided I wanted to use some pastel chalks for shading in all the crevices, all the nooks and crannies of the face itself. So, of course, for using pastel chalks, you grind some of the chalk onto some sandpaper. I used a mix of black and brown, and then I came back with a fine point detail brush, as you can see here. And you put some of the chalk, onto the brush, and then you go into all the little nooks and crannies, filling in the little shadowy areas. You also do the nostrils, the areas around the eyes. And here's an example. I used the second head that John supplied to me, and this also shows you the separate hair piece, because on this head, obviously, I didn't use the mohawk, and so the whole idea of this was to not only show the shading that I did on the face, but also that little bit of a hair piece there. And then, of course, when it came to the mouth, I started with a dark burgundy color to fill in the whole mouth area. I wanted to make sure that the back portion of the mouth was plenty dark. Then I came back with some pink, and I painted the tongue. I also painted the teeth using an ivory color, and then the eyes were also painted an ivory color. It's always best not to use a bright white. You want to try to avoid using bright white and go with an off-white, an ivory color, a warm oyster gray, something other than white. And this, of course, shows you the final face. This was the head that I used on the kit. The eyes were then painted brown. So you just put a little crescent in on the black areas of the pupil. I did a red wash over the eyes so that the red would go into all the little corners and along the edge. And again, you can see the nostrils were also painted. Well, I actually used pastel chalks on the nostrils. Some shading was done around the eyes. Here's a nice close-up of the mouth, and you can see where I used a darker color at the base of each tooth. That was done as a wash, and to soften the line, I simply came back with the ivory and dry brushed the teeth a little bit, and then I painted around the whole perimeter of the mouth with kind of a reddish pink color. And for more information about painting faces, see my other video, Figure Model Basics 2.0. I also came back and using black, I painted the claws and his toenails. The next thing, of course, was to paint the base. And there was a tremendous amount of texture on the base. I decided just to simply brush paint that. I wanted to start with a dark tone. So, and of course I had to paint the log as well. So here I'm using a very dark chocolate brown, and I use this color to paint over the entire base. I wanted to make sure I had plenty of good coverage here. You know, you want to make sure you get into all the little nooks and crannies. And I could have just as easily airbrushed this, but I just figured instead of cleaning the airbrush and setting it all up, I just went ahead and using a rather wide brush, I simply brush painted it all. Here I'm nearing completion on the base. You want to make sure you get around the edges really well, as you know, and not only the top surface. And here's the entire base once it's completely dried. And I want to come back in the areas I'm pointing out here, and I'm going to airbrush those areas using a green, because it looks like there's grass and some foliage there. So I mixed up a green, and again, using the Badger Anthem airbrush, I very carefully and strategically applied some green paint into those areas. I went with a kind of a medium green color here because I knew that the green wasn't going to cover all that well, so I didn't want to start with too dark of a color. You don't even really need to get complete coverage here. All you're simply trying to do is show the difference in color, because I'm going to come back later with a lighter shade and I'm going to dry brush those areas. And of course, by airbrushing, it's giving me a very soft edge, a soft transition. It's going to give me a soft transition between the green foliage and the brown earth. See, here's a nice soft edge. And of course, this way, when I come back and dry brush both the green and a lighter shade of brown, that transition becomes even more apparent. So all the areas here have been hit with green that really kind of needed them. There's some areas where it looks like there's some leaves. Now here I'm mixing up the lighter shade of green for the dry brushing effect. And I simply use some green, yellow, and white, and I mix those. And here's actually the finished base once the green has been dry brushed and the brown, a lighter shade of brown, was applied as a dry brushing. And you can see how, again, all that texture just pops out. By using some simple colors on a palette, you can achieve results like this. Here is the log. The log was given a base tone of a very dark gray. And then I went ahead and I glued it in place. Then I simply came back with various shades of browns, grays, and even some green. And again, I dry brushed the log. And you can see how all that texture just pops out. And here's the finished model. This model was a whole lot of fun to build and paint. And if you don't have one yet, contact John Diaz at Resin Realities and order one today. You can also check out all the other kits John has on the website. So until next time, this is Phil Lister saying, go build a model.